Now that we have Node modules included in the published output, let's take a look at an additional option for .NET Publish, which is sometimes very useful, and that is the -- self-contained option. Without this option, I'm publishing output files that depend on a target framework already being installed on the server or the hosting environment where I'm going to move this application to. But there are some situations where, depending on a pre-installed framework, has some drawbacks. For one, you might want to take a dependency on a framework that is newer than what you have in production. We know sometimes production environments can move slowly. We also might be in a situation where there are multiple applications deployed into a production environment, and we want to make sure that if someone upgrades or patches a framework on that machine to fix something in application A, it doesn't impact our application, application B. We want everything that this application needs to be in the published output so we can copy everything that this application needs over to the other server. Of course, there's also some drawbacks to having a self-contained deployment. If there is some sort of security patch that can be applied to a target framework in a hosting environment, if all the applications are depending on that target framework on a shared installation, I can upgrade that framework once and be sure that all the applications are using the latest bits. But if I have a self-contained application somewhere on the system, I can have situations where that self-contained application will be using different bits than the shared target framework install. But let's take a look at what this does. If I try to publish with -- self-contained here, I'm going to eventually run into an error. And that error is that I need to specify a runtime identifier or turn off the self-contained flag. And this makes sense. If I want to create a self-contained application, now what .NET Publish has to do is include an entire runtime in the published output. And the question is, which runtime should .NET Publish include? Because there's many different versions of the runtime. There's the version that runs on 32-bit Windows, and 64-bit Windows, and 64-bit Linux. Which one of those is the runtime that I want? I need to know where I'm going to deploy this application and what the target system looks like. What is the architecture, 32-bit or 64-bit? What's the operating system? Once I have all that figured out, I can then select the runtime identifier that I need. And I can do that by executing this command again and passing a -r option and then a runtime identifier. So what is a runtime identifier? Well, if you go to your favorite search engine and search for .NET Core Runtime Identifier, you should see a link to the .NET Core RID catalog, so Runtime Identifier catalog. This will list the small mnemonics that we can use as runtime identifiers. So for example, if I want to target 32-bit Windows, very generic, I'm not being specific and saying it's going to be Windows 10, I'm just saying a generic 32-bit Windows environment, then I would use Win-x86. And of course, there's also the 64-bit version, Win-x64. And looking through this list, you can find a generic Linux runtime identifier, or what we call the portable identifier, and the same for Mac OS is going to be on here somewhere down this list. What I'm going to specify is a runtime identifier of Win-x64. So back in the command line, Win-x64 is going to be my target system because I'm going to deploy this application on the system that I'm currently executing on, which is 64-bit Windows. And now it's going to take a little bit longer to do this publish operation, and what we're going to find in the output folder is quite a bit more output. There's many more DLL files and assemblies inside of this folder now because we have the entire framework in this folder. So not only do I have my dependencies like odecode.useNodeModules, I also have system.xml.dll that provides all the XML support for .NET Core. Yes, of course, I still have my www.root folder, but I also have files that will be specific to 64-bit Windows, like windowsbase.dll. So I cannot take this application now and deploy it onto a Linux system. I would need to do a separate publish operation and produce the output for Linux x64, and I could take those files and put them on Linux. Also, now if I try to do a .NET on odefoo.dll, well, it might work because I am on a system where the .NET CLI is installed, but because we want this application to be completely self-contained, I might copy these files to a system that does not have the .NET CLI. It doesn't have a framework or an SDK installed. And because of that, in addition to finding odefoo.dll in this folder, and what I'm looking for actually is in the output folder, so let's look inside of odefoo. What I should see in this folder now is an odefoo.exe. So now if I want to run my application, I can type ode to food, and then ode to food.dll. So essentially, ode to food.exe replaces the .NET command in the .NET CLI. This application is now self-contained. So now that we have a published self-contained application, the next step after publishing is to do a deployment. Let's try that next.